There exists within the Imperium a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of the void, nor the silence of the tomb, but something far more terrible. It is the silence of those who remember, yet cannot speak, of those who witnessed humanity's golden age, yet find the words inadequate, impossible, or simply too painful to share. These are the ancient Dreadnoughts, the oldest warriors of the Adeptus Astartes, entombed within walking sarcophagi of adamantium and ceramite, preserved for millennia beyond the death that should have claimed them. And when younger battle brothers asked them what it felt like to walk among the stars during the Great Crusade, when the Emperor himself led humanity's armies, when the Primarchs were whole and the dream of unity seemed within reach, these ancients often grow quiet. Their mechanical voices cease their crackling emanations, their weapon systems power down, and in that silence lies a tragedy that spans 10,000 years. You might wonder why these living relics, these warriors who fought at the very dawn of the Imperium, who stood in the presence of beings that have since passed into legend, would be reluctant to share their memories. After all, they are consulted for their wisdom, awakened from stasis sleep when their knowledge is required, revered as walking embodiments of their chapters' histories. They are treated as sacred repositories of the past, honored ancients whose every word carries the weight of ages. Surely they would want to share what they witnessed, to pass down the glory and wonder of fighting beside the Emperor, of watching Primarchs lead their legions to victory after victory, of being part of the greatest military campaign in human history. Yet they remain silent, or worse, they speak in fragments, in tactical assessments devoid of emotion, in statistical analyses that capture the mechanics of war but nothing of its feeling. They recite dates and battle plans, troop movements and casualty figures, as if they were reading from ancient data logs rather than describing events they personally witnessed. And when pressed further, when asked not just what happened but how it felt, they often withdraw entirely, requesting return to stasis, or simply refusing to elaborate beyond the bare facts. This silence is not accidental. It is not the product of simple reticence, or some ancient protocol that forbids them from speaking freely. No, the reasons these ancient dreadnoughts will not describe what the Great Crusade felt like run far deeper than mere unwillingness. They touch upon the very nature of what it means to be a dreadnought, upon the terrible price of their preservation, upon the slow erosion of everything that makes a consciousness truly alive. To understand why they cannot or will not speak, we must first understand what they are, what they have lost, and what horrors lie hidden in the gaps of their memories. The nature of the dreadnought. Before we can understand why ancient dreadnoughts will not speak of the Great Crusade, we must understand what happens when a space marine is interred within one of these walking tombs. The process is not simple preservation, it is transformation, and not all of what is transformed survives intact. When a space marine suffers wounds so catastrophic that even the advanced medical technology of the Adeptus Astartes cannot restore him to combat effectiveness, his chapter faces a choice. They can grant him the Emperor's peace, extracting his gene seed to create future generations and allowing the warrior his final rest. Or they can preserve what remains of him within the armored shell of a dreadnought, extending his service indefinitely at a cost that few fully understand at the time of internment. The physical reality of becoming a dreadnought is horrific. What remains of the marine's body is often little more than a torso and head, kept alive in a bath of amniotic fluid within a sealed sarcophagus. His limbs are gone, replaced by weapons and actuators. His eyes no longer see, replaced by optical sensors. His ears no longer hear, replaced by acoustic arrays. Every sense he once possessed is filtered through mechanical systems, translated by the dreadnought's machine spirit into something his brain can process. He breathes the amniotic fluid that sustains him, each breath a reminder that he is no longer flesh, but something between man and machine. The neural interface that connects the marine's consciousness to the dreadnought is extensive and invasive. Cables penetrate deep into his brain, creating pathways for the impulses that control the massive war machine systems. Through these connections, he can move the Dreadnought's limbs, fire its weapons, process data from its sensors. But the interface is not perfect, and it comes with costs that compound over time. The process of implantation itself is so painful that it can kill even a space marine through shock. Despite their enhanced physiology, their hip no conditioning against pain, their ability to endure wounds that would kill normal humans instantly, the insertion of neural connectors into a conscious brain is agony beyond description. Many Marines hover on the edge of death during the procedure, kept alive only by the constant ministrations of apothecaries and the desperate prayers of tech Marines. Some do not survive. Those who do are forever changed, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually. Once interred, the Marine exists in a state unlike anything a living being experiences. When not needed for battle or consultation, he sleeps in stasis, a form of suspended animation that preserves his remaining organic tissue and gives his overtaxed mind respite from the constant strain of interfacing with the Dreadnought. This sleep is not like natural sleep. It is deeper, more complete, a cessation of consciousness so total that when awakening comes, it often takes time for the Dreadnought to remember who and what he is. Between these periods of stasis when the Dreadnought is active, he experiences existence through mechanical filters. The weight of the machine, tons of adamantium and ceramite, becomes his body. The thunder of heavy weapons becomes his voice. The wash of sensor data becomes his sight and hearing. He cannot feel the sun on his skin, cannot taste food, cannot smell the air of whatever world he fights upon. All of these basic sensations of life are gone, replaced by approximations and measurements that tell him what his surroundings are like without letting him truly experience them. And all the while, the neural interface exerts constant pressure on his mind. Extended connection to a machine as large and complex as a Dreadnought causes immense mental stress. Over time, this stress manifests as various forms of cognitive degradation. Lethargy, where the Dreadnought's response is slow and his thoughts become sluggish. Confusion, where past and present blur together. Dyschronometria, a condition where the perception of time becomes distorted, making it impossible to accurately judge whether an event happened yesterday or a century ago. And eventually, in many cases, senility, a gradual dissolution of the personality and memories that defined the warrior before his internment. This is the baseline reality for all Dreadnoughts. But for those who have served for centuries or millennia, who were interred during or shortly after the Great Crusade itself, these effects are magnified 1,000-fold. They have endured not just years of this existence, but 10,000 years, cycling between active service and stasis countless times, each awakening eroding a bit more of who they were, each return to sleep severing them further from the continuity of experience that normal consciousness requires. The ancient Dreadnoughts are, in many ways, the most tragic figures in the Imperium. They are revered and honored, yes, but they are also prisoners. They cannot leave their sarcophagi. They cannot return to flesh. They cannot die unless destroyed in battle. They can only continue serving a cause that has changed beyond recognition, fighting for an Imperium that barely resembles the one they helped build, remembering less and less of the glory days that made their sacrifice seem worthwhile. The Great Crusade, a golden age. Lost. To understand what the ancient Dreadnoughts have lost, to grasp why their silence carries such weight, we must understand what the Great Crusade truly was. Not just the historical facts, the dates and battles and conquests, but the feeling of it, the atmosphere that pervaded the Imperium during those 2 centuries when everything seemed possible and victory seemed assured. The Great Crusade began sometime around the year 798 of the 30th millennium and lasted for approximately 200 years before giving way to the Horus heresy. It was launched by the Emperor of Mankind, after he had united Terra through the Unification Wars and forged alliances with the Mechanicum of Mars. With the warp storms that had isolated humanity's scattered colonies for 5,000 years finally subsiding, the Emperor saw his chance to reunite the species under a single banner and reclaim the stars that had once been mankind's birthright. But these are just facts, dates and demographics that capture nothing of what it felt like to be part of that great endeavor. To fight during the Great Crusade was to be part of something larger than warfare, larger than conquest. It was to be an instrument of humanity's rebirth, a warrior in the greatest military campaign in human history, a participant in the fulfillment of a vision 10,000 years in the making. Imagine being a space marine during those early years. You are one of 20 legions, brotherhood in arms numbering tens of thousands of warriors, each a superhuman killing machine forged from the Emperor's own genetic template. You fight not just for victory, but for the future of your entire species. Every world you bring to compliance is one more step toward unifying mankind. Every Xenos empire you destroy is one less threat to humanity's survival. Every triumph brings you closer to a galaxy where humans no longer need to fear the dark between the stars. And you do not fight alone. The Emperor himself walks among you, not some distant figure speaking through intermediaries, not a god remote and unknowable, but a physical presence on the battlefield, a being of such power and majesty that simply witnessing him fills you with certainty that your cause is righteous and your victory inevitable. When the Emperor leads an assault, there is no question of the outcome. When he speaks, his words carry absolute conviction. When he looks upon his warriors, each one feels seen, known, valued. Then, as the crusade progresses, the Primarchs are found. One by one, the Emperor's lost sons are discovered on far-flung worlds where the warp had scattered them decades earlier. And what beings they are. Each Primarch is a demigod made flesh, possessing abilities and charisma that make them seem like the heroes of ancient legend brought to life. They are brilliant strategists, peerless warriors, natural leaders who inspire absolute loyalty in their sons. When a legion is reunited with its Primarch, when the Space Marines meet their gene father for the first time, it is a moment of transcendent joy and purpose. They are no longer just warriors. They are the sons of gods, fighting alongside fathers who embody everything they aspire to be. The scale of the Great Crusade was staggering. At its peak, over 4,300 expeditionary fleets ranged across the galaxy, each one a massive military force capable of bringing entire star systems into compliance. Billions of soldiers from the Imperial Army supported the Space Marines, while Titan legions provided heavy firepower, and the Mechanicum's tech priests ensured that the Imperium's war machine never faltered. It was warfare on a scale that had not been seen since the Dark Age of technology, and would never be seen again. But more than the scale, more than the victories, what defined the Great Crusade was the sense of hope and purpose that pervaded it. Yes, it was war. Yes, countless beings died as the Imperium expanded. Yes, entire Xenos civilizations were exterminated, and human worlds that refused compliance were brought to heel by force. But from the perspective of those who fought it, the Great Crusade was not mere conquest. It was salvation. It was the rescue of humanity from 5,000 years of isolation and terror. It was the building of something that would endure, a galactic empire that would protect mankind from all threats, internal and external, forever. The Space Marines who fought in the Great Crusade believed in this vision with every fiber of their being. They had to, because it was the only thing that made their sacrifices meaningful. But more than that, they could see the vision taking shape with each passing year. World after world accepted Imperial rule. The Imperium's borders expanded at an unprecedented rate. Technology long lost was being recovered and put back into service. Humanity was rising from the ashes of old night, and the Marines who fought for this cause knew they were part of something historic, something that future generations would look back on with wonder. There was also during the earlier years of the Crusade, a sense of brotherhood among the legions that would later be shattered by the heresy. Yes, there were rivalries and disagreements. Yes, some Primarchs clashed in personality and philosophy. But these were the conflicts of brothers, disagreements within a family that shared common cause and common father. When legions fought together, combining their strengths to overcome particularly difficult objectives, there was a sense of unity in purpose that transcended their differences. The combined operations during the Great Crusade were spectacles of coordination and power that the fragmented Imperium of the 41st millennium can barely imagine. When the Emperor's children and the Iron Hands fought together, Fulgrim's pursuit of perfection complemented Ferrus Manus's technological mastery in ways that made both legions more effective than they would have been separately. When the Space Wolves and the Dark Angels cooperated, despite their fundamental philosophical differences, their combined might was enough to break civilizations that had stood for millennia. When the Ultramarines and the Word-Bearers campaigned side by side before Lorgar's fall, the combination of Guilliman's strategic brilliance and the Word-Bearers' zealous determination brought world after world into compliance with unprecedented efficiency. These were not merely tactical arrangements, but genuine bonds of brotherhood. The legions shared supplies, traded tactical intelligence, celebrated victories together, and mourned losses as if they were their own. After particularly difficult campaigns, it was not uncommon for different legions to hold joint ceremonies honoring the fallen from all participating forces, treating warriors from other gene lines as if they were blood brothers. The legions understood that they were part of something larger than their individual identities, that they were all sons of the same emperor, all fighting for the same dream of human unity. Veterans who fought in multiple campaigns with different legions would form bonds that crossed gene seed lines. A sergeant from the Imperial Fists might develop deep respect for a captain of the Salamanders after fighting beside him for months. A chaplain from the Raven Guard might form philosophical friendships with a librarian from the Thousand Sons. These relationships were treasured, spoken of with pride, seen as evidence that the Emperor's vision of unity was not just theoretical, but was being realized in practice. The Great Crusade's most renowned victories often came from these combined operations. The Ulanor Crusade, which would mark the apex of the Great Crusade's triumphs, involved forces from multiple legions working in perfect coordination. The Lunar Wolves, the White Scars, the Blood Angels, and others combined their strengths in a campaign that showcased what the Emperor's legions could achieve when fighting as one unified force. The defeat of the Orc warlord on Ulanor was not just a military victory, but a demonstration that the Emperor's dream of human unity, of disparate forces working together toward common purpose, was achievable. This sense of brotherhood extended beyond just the Space Marines. The Imperial army forces that fought alongside the legions, the Titan crews that provided heavy support, the tech priests who maintained the war machines, the remembrancers who documented the Crusade's progress, all of these felt part of a common enterprise. There was a genuine sense that everyone involved, from the lowest soldier to the Emperor himself, was working toward the same goal, that personal ambitions and individual glory were secondary to the great project of unifying humanity. For a Space Marine interred in a Dreadnought during this era, these memories would have been his most precious possessions. The memory of fighting beside the Emperor on some distant world, hearing his voice issue commands, witnessing his power unleashed against the enemies of mankind. The memory of the day his Primarch was found, when his legion was made whole and given direction by a being who seemed to understand them utterly. The memory of victories won alongside brother legions, when warriors from different Primarchs fought as one. The memory of the certainty, the absolute conviction, that they were building something eternal. The discovery of each Primarch was itself an event of profound significance, not just for the legion that was reunited with its gene father, but for the entire Crusade. When the Emperor found one of his lost sons, it was a moment of joy that resonated throughout the growing Imperium. Another piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. Another legion was made complete. Another superhuman general joined the Emperor's councils. The momentum of the Crusade seemed to accelerate with each reunion, as if the galaxy itself recognized that humanity's ascendancy was inevitable. Some Primarchs were found on worlds where they had become kings or conquerors, their natural abilities allowing them to rise to positions of power despite their inhuman origins. Others were discovered in more humble circumstances, their true nature hidden or suppressed by the societies that raised them. But regardless of their circumstances, each Primarch recognized the Emperor as their father the moment they met him. There was an instant connection, a recognition at the genetic and spiritual level that transcended words or explanation. The Space Marines who witnessed these reunions spoke of them as transcendent experiences. To see your Primarch for the first time, to feel the psychic presence of a being crafted from the Emperor's own genetic essence, to understand in that moment that everything you are flows from him. This was a revelation that many Marines compared to religious awakening. The sense of completion, of finding something you did not know you had been missing, was overwhelming in its intensity. These are the memories that the ancient Dreadnoughts carry. These are the experiences they witnessed firsthand, that no one else in the 41st millennium can claim to have lived through. And these are the memories that they will not share, that they cannot adequately describe, for reasons that run far deeper than simple unwillingness to speak. The emotional richness of these experiences, the sense of being part of something larger and more important than any individual could achieve alone, the certainty that humanity's future was secure and glorious. All of this has been eroded by 10 millennia of service, leaving only fragments, too disconnected, to convey the truth of what was lost. Memory degradation and the erosion of self. The central tragedy of the ancient Dreadnoughts lies not in what they remember, but in what they have forgotten, or more precisely, in the way their memories have degraded over 10 millennia of service, leaving them with fragments of data but little of the emotional context that made those experiences meaningful. The human brain, even one enhanced by Space Marine augmentation, was not designed to interface with machines for centuries at a time. The neural connections required to control a Dreadnought are extensive and invasive, creating pathways that allow the pilot's thoughts to control tons of adamantium and sophisticated weapon systems. But these connections exact a terrible toll on the organic brain tissue they penetrate. Extended neural interface with a vehicle as large and complex as a Dreadnought causes immense mental stress on the occupant. This is not speculation or theory. It is documented in the records of every chapter that maintains Dreadnoughts, observed by the tech Marines who service these war machines, and experienced firsthand by every Dreadnought who has served for more than a few centuries. The strain manifests in several ways, each one contributing to the slow erosion of the pilot's consciousness. Lethargy is often the first sign. The Dreadnought's response is slow, his speech becomes less fluid, his reactions less sharp. Where once he moved with the speed and precision expected of a Space Marine, now there are delays, hesitations, moments where the pilot seems to struggle to maintain connection with his mechanical body. Tech Marines attribute this to the increasing difficulty the organic brain experiences in maintaining command over the Dreadnought's systems, as if the flesh component is slowly losing its battle for dominance over the machine. Confusion follows. Past battles begin to blur together. The Dreadnought might wake from stasis, believing he is about to fight a campaign that ended centuries ago. He might address battle brothers by names of warriors long dead, or speak of Primarchs as if they were still present and active. This is not senility in the conventional sense, not yet, but rather a disruption of the brain's ability to properly sequence memories, to place events in their correct temporal order. Dyschronometria is particularly insidious. This condition affects the Dreadnought's perception of time itself, making it impossible to accurately judge temporal intervals. A battle that lasted 6 hours might feel like it went on for days. A period of stasis that lasted decades might feel like mere moments upon awakening. For ancient dreadnoughts who have experienced hundreds or thousands of cycles of waking and sleeping, this complete loss of temporal reference is catastrophic. They can no longer be certain whether an event they remember happened last year or 5,000 years ago. Without reliable time perception, the very structure of autobiographical memory breaks down. The organic components of the dreadnought's brain continue to deteriorate despite the life support systems that keep them alive. Neural tissue ages, even when preserved in amniotic fluid and sustained by advanced medical technology. Connections between neurons break down. The structures responsible for encoding and retrieving memories become less efficient. This is separate from the damage caused by the neural interface itself. This is simple biological decay, the inexorable entropy that affects all living tissue over sufficient timescales. But perhaps most devastating is the nature of how dreadnoughts remember. When a space marine recalls a battle he fought in his flesh and blood days, he doesn't just remember tactical data. He remembers how it felt, the weight of his bolter in his hands, the sound of his brother's war cries in his ears, the smell of promethium from burning buildings, the surge of adrenaline when the enemy charged, the satisfaction of a clean kill, the grief when a brother fell. These sensory and emotional components are integral to human memory. They are what make a memory feel real, what make it more than just abstract information. Dreadnoughts lose this. Their memories become increasingly abstract, increasingly divorced from sensory experience. They remember that they fought on a certain world, but not what that world looked like beyond sensor data. They remember that a battle brother died, but not the emotional impact of that loss. They remember that they served with a particular Primarch, but the feeling of being in that Primarch's presence, the awe and loyalty and love that defined their relationship with their gene father, these fade to nothing over the centuries. What remains is tactical data, battle plans, enemy force compositions, casualty figures, objective assessments of strategic outcomes, the kind of information that can be stored in a database, that doesn't require organic memory at all. This is what ancient dreadnoughts can reliably recall and share with those who consult them. This is why they are still valuable to their chapters despite their deterioration. They are living tactical databases, repositories of military knowledge spanning millennia. But when asked about the experience of the Great Crusade, about what it felt like to fight during that golden age, they have little to offer. The emotional content, the subjective experience, the felt sense of hope and purpose and brotherhood that defined those years has eroded away, leaving only the bare bones of factual information. They know they fought alongside the Emperor. They cannot describe what it felt like to be in his presence. They know their Primarch led them to victory after victory. They cannot convey the inspiration they felt when following him into battle. Some ancient dreadnoughts are acutely aware of this loss. They know that younger brothers expect something from them, some transmission of wisdom and experience that goes beyond tactical doctrine. They know they are supposed to be living connections to the Imperium's golden age, but when they search their degraded memories for the experiences they are supposed to share, they find only fragments, isolated moments that no longer connect into coherent narrative, emotions they remember having but can no longer feel, a past that has become as alien to them as it is to the young Marines who never lived it. Other dreadnoughts have deteriorated to the point where they no longer remember that they have forgotten. Their condition progresses past confusion into something approaching senility, where the personality that was once a space marine has been largely replaced by a machine intelligence that responds to tactical situations but possesses little interior life. These ancients can still fight. Their weapon systems function perfectly. Their tactical assessment capabilities remain sharp, but the consciousness that, once animated, them has worn away to almost nothing, leaving a ghost in the machine that follows its programming, but feels nothing, remembers nothing of what it once was. This is the fate that awaits all dreadnoughts who serve long enough. It is inevitable, unavoidable, written into the very nature of their existence. Every period of active service wears away a bit more of their organic components. Every cycle of stasis sleep disrupts memory consolidation, making it harder to retain new experiences or access old ones. Every century that passes sees them becoming less the warrior they once were, and more a weapon system that happens to contain a remnant of human consciousness. The ancient dreadnoughts know this. Those who retain enough self-awareness understand what is happening to them, even if they cannot stop it. They feel themselves slipping away, personality and memory and emotion eroding like sand in an hourglass. And this knowledge adds another layer to their silence. Why speak of the Great Crusade when the words cannot capture what it truly was? Why try to describe experiences that have faded to mere tactical data? Why force themselves to confront how much they have lost? The stasis sleep. Gaps in continuity. If the neural interface erodes memory slowly over active service, then stasis sleep shatters the continuity of consciousness in ways that make coherent autobiographical memory nearly impossible. When a dreadnought is not needed for active service, he is placed into stasis. This is not done casually. Maintaining a dreadnought in active state requires constant oversight by tech marines. The strain on the pilot's mind from extended interface with the machine necessitates periods of rest. And from a practical standpoint, chapters cannot afford to wear out their precious ancient warriors on minor engagements. Dreadnoughts are strategic assets, brought out only when their firepower and experience are truly needed. So between battles, between wars, sometimes between decades or centuries of wars, the dreadnoughts sleep. Their sarcophagi are sealed in stasis vaults deep within their chapter's fortress monastery. Their biological functions slow to the barest minimum needed to sustain life. Their consciousness fades into nothingness, a void so complete that philosophers have debated whether the dreadnought truly exists during these periods, or whether the being who awakens is somehow different from the one who went to sleep. From the dreadnaught's perspective, stasis sleep is instant and total. One moment he is conscious, being prepared for stasis by tech marines, feeling the cold numbness spreading through his systems as the stasis field activates. The next moment, with no sense of time having passed, he is awakening, often to a completely different situation than the one he left. Imagine being told that you are being put into deep freeze for a while. You close your eyes. You open them. The tech marine standing before you is different, younger, than the one who sealed you in stasis. The fortress monastery's architecture has changed. The battle brothers surrounding your sarcophagus speak with unfamiliar accents, use slang you don't recognize, wear armor in patterns you've never seen. And when you ask how long you slept, you are told 73 years, or 140 years, or 3 centuries. This is the reality for ancient dreadnoughts. They do not experience the passage of time while in stasis. They receive no input, form no memories, maintain no continuity of consciousness. From their subjective perspective, the galaxy lurches forward in discontinuous jumps, each awakening revealing a world that has aged while they remained frozen. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Human consciousness, even space marine consciousness, relies on continuity for its coherence. We understand who we are through the thread of our experiences, one moment leading to the next, in an unbroken chain from birth to present. Even when we sleep, we maintain a sense of that continuity. We know that only hours have passed, that we are waking in the same world we left, that the people around us have aged at the same rate we have. Dreadnoughts lose this completely. They become unstuck in time, jumping forward in discontinuous leaps, experiencing the galaxy in disconnected snapshots separated by decades or centuries of nothing. And with each jump forward, they find that more has changed than they can easily process. Battle brothers they knew have died. Entire generations of Marines have come and gone. The enemies the chapter faced when the dreadnought went to sleep have been defeated or have moved on. New threats have emerged that the dreadnought has no context for. The political situation of the Imperium has shifted in ways that would have taken years of continuous experience to understand, but which the Dreadnought must now comprehend through briefings that can never convey the full reality of what transpired. Worse, the Dreadnought's chapter itself evolves. Traditions shift, new rituals are adopted, language changes. The culture that the Dreadnought knew, the unspoken assumptions and shared experiences that made him part of his brotherhood, gradually becomes alien to him. He awakens to find his battle brothers treating customs he considered recent innovations as ancient traditions. He uses phrases that mark him as hopelessly out of date. He references events that no living Marine except himself remembers. This creates a profound sense of isolation. The ancient Dreadnought is surrounded by his brothers, is honored and revered by them, but he is not truly one of them anymore. He is a visitor from another age, a relic that has outlived its own time. The young Marines look at him with awe, but also with incomprehension. They cannot conceive of what it is like to have lived for 10,000 years, but experienced only decades of consciousness, scattered across that vast span in isolated fragments. The gaps in memory caused by stasis sleep compound the degradation caused by the neural interface. Even in normal aging, memory consolidation occurs during sleep. The brain processes the experiences of the day, deciding what to store in long-term memory and what to discard. But Dreadnoughts in stasis do not sleep in any normal sense. They cease to be. When they awaken, there has been no consolidation, no integration of their most recent active period into their overall autobiography. Each period of consciousness becomes an island, poorly connected to what came before and what will come after. Over time, this leads to a fragmentary sense of self. Ancient Dreadnoughts remember the Great Crusade, yes, but they remember it as a series of disconnected episodes rather than a coherent narrative. They fought at the siege of this world, but cannot remember what campaign that siege was part of. They recall serving under a particular captain, but not why that captain mattered or what became of him. They have memories of their Primarch, but these memories exist in isolation, stripped of the context that would make them meaningful stories rather than bare facts. They also lose the ability to properly sequence events. Without continuous experience marking the passage of time, without the gradual accumulation of memories that allows normal consciousness to understand temporal relationships, ancient Dreadnoughts often cannot say with certainty whether one battle happened before or after another. They know both battles occurred during the Great Crusade, but the exact order, the causal relationships between events, the narrative thread that would tie them together into a coherent history, has been lost. This makes it nearly impossible for ancient Dreadnoughts to answer questions about what the Great Crusade felt like as an experience, as a continuous lived reality. They have the pieces, but cannot reassemble them into the whole. They have the notes, but have lost the melody. And the gaps between their islands of memory grow wider with each cycle of stasis, until eventually they are not experiencing their lives so much as experiencing a series of isolated moments separated by voids of non-existence. Some ancient Dreadnoughts cope with this by treating each awakening as its own discrete existence. They do not try to maintain continuity across stasis periods. They do not torment themselves by trying to remember what has been lost. They simply wake, fight, serve, and return to stasis, accepting that their existence has become episodic rather than continuous. Others are haunted by the gaps. They feel the absence of all those years they did not experience. They understand that the galaxy has moved on without them, that they are constantly arriving late to a story that has already progressed far beyond where they left it. They are perpetual strangers in their own time, forever out of sync with the world around them. And still others have reached a point where they no longer recognize that there are gaps at all. Their degradation has progressed so far that they can no longer distinguish between memory and fantasy, between events they actually experienced and events they only heard about. Their recollections of the Great Crusade become confused with battles they fought millennia later, creating a composite memory that is part history, part imagination, and wholly unreliable as a factual account. When an ancient dreadnought is asked to describe what the Great Crusade felt like, all of these factors conspire to make the request impossible to fulfill. The emotional content has eroded. The continuity has been shattered. The ability to distinguish reliable memory from degraded impression has been compromised. What remains is a collection of fragments, stark and isolated, stripped of the context that would make them meaningful to anyone who did not live through that era themselves. Bjorn the Fell-Handed, the burden of being the eldest. If we want to understand what it means to be an ancient dreadnought who remembers the Great Crusade, we need look no further than Bjorn the Fell-Handed of the Space Wolves chapter. At over 10,000 standard years old, Bjorn is the longest living space marine in the Imperium, aside from the Emperor himself and a few nameless Blood Angels dreadnoughts lost to the Black Rage. He fought beside Leman Russ during the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. He saw the Emperor in the flesh before he was interred upon the Golden Throne. He was present at the Battle of Prospero, the scouring of Istvan Thra, and countless other pivotal moments of that legendary age. Bjorn should be the ultimate source of wisdom about the Great Crusade. He should be able to tell the Space Wolves, and indeed the entire Imperium, what that golden age truly felt like, what it meant to serve under a Primarch who still walked among his sons, what glory and purpose drove the legions as they conquered the galaxy. His memories should be priceless, irreplaceable accounts of an era that no historian can fully reconstruct. But Bjorn's story is one of loss as much as preservation. What survives in his degraded consciousness is not the glorious history his brothers expect, but fragments of a past that grows more distant and less real with each awakening. Bjorn was interred in his dreadnought sarcophagus sometime after the Horus Heresy, but before he could complete his term as the first Great Wolf, the leader of the Space Wolves chapter, after Leman Russ's disappearance. The exact circumstances of his wounding are lost to history, but the result was clear. Bjorn the warrior, the hero who had fought beside his Primarch and survived the greatest civil war in human history, was too damaged to continue serving in flesh. The Space Wolves, unable to bear losing such a revered hero, interred him in one of the most technologically advanced dreadnought chassis in existence, a machine that allowed him to fight with something, approaching his former fluidity and speed. For a time, this seemed like a blessing. Bjorn continued to serve, leading his brothers in battle, offering counsel based on his vast experience. His sullen personality, exacerbated by bitterness over Leman Russ's departure without him, made him difficult company, but none could question his effectiveness as a weapon of war. His personal kill count rivaled that of entire chapters. His tactical acumen saved the Space Wolves from catastrophe on numerous occasions. But as the centuries turned into millennia, as Bjorn cycled between active service and stasis sleep hundreds of times, the toll became apparent. The Space Wolves noticed that their great hero's responses were slowing. His memory, once perfect in its recollection of battles past, began to show gaps and inconsistencies. He would wake from stasis and ask for brothers who had died centuries before, or speak of enemies long since defeated, as if they still posed threats. More troubling was what Bjorn said when he did speak of the past. Where the Space Wolves expected tales of glory, accounts of their Primarch's brilliance, descriptions of the Great Crusade's triumphs, Bjorn offered mostly silence. Or worse, when pressed, he would speak in fragments, disconnected observations that captured facts but nothing of feeling. He could recite the details of the Battle of Prospero with mechanical precision, but when asked what it felt like to burn his brother Legion's homeworld, he had little to say. The reasons become clear in the accounts we have of Bjorn's later awakenings. According to sources, Bjorn desperately wishes to remember his glory days, the crusades he fought with Leman Russ, the great enemies he felled. But when he searches his degraded memory for these experiences, what he finds is incomplete and frustrating. The sensory details have faded. The emotional context has eroded. What should be vivid recollections of the greatest era of his life have become vague impressions and disconnected data points. Worse, what Bjorn does remember clearly has become painful rather than glorious. He remembers how his chapter has changed, how the space wolves of the 41st millennium are so far removed from the Legion he knew that they seem like strangers, wearing familiar heraldry. He remembers with bitter clarity being awakened again and again to find everything changed while he remained frozen. He remembers the isolation of existing across vast gulfs of time, always arriving centuries late to understand the context of whatever crisis he has been awakened to address. There is a particularly telling passage in the lore where Bjorn's perspective is described after one of his awakenings. His memories of the glory days have faded, but what he remembers with painful clarity are the howling idiots of the modern space wolves, the wolves' talismans plastered on everything, the way his brothers have reduced the sophisticated warrior culture he knew to crude caricature. He remembers laughing when the Iron Priest told him about thunderwolves, those absurd giant beasts the modern chapter rides into battle, a practice that would have been unthinkable in his day. From the Dreadnoughts speakers, his laughter sounded like booming thunder, and his brothers interpreted it as approval, which only deepened his despair. He has become so disconnected from his chapter that even his expressions of dismay are misread as endorsement. But what makes Bjorn truly sorrowful, what cuts deepest, is that he has gotten used to it. The degradation, the isolation, the disappointment of each awakening. He has come to accept that this is what his existence is now. The space wolves will wake him. He will play along, perform the expected theatrics of the ancient hero. He will fight their battles and offer what counsel he can. And then he will return to stasis, knowing that when he wakes again, more time will have passed, more will have changed, and he will be even more of an anachronism than before. This acceptance is perhaps the most tragic aspect of Bjorn's existence. He has been worn down by time and repetition to the point where he no longer fights against the loss of his past. He has learned that trying to hold on to memories that are slipping away only makes the loss more painful. Better to let them fade, to exist in the eternal present of each awakening, than to torment himself with what he can no longer clearly recall. When young space wolves ask Bjorn about the Great Crusade, about Lemon Russ, about what it felt like to fight when the Emperor still walked among his warriors, they are asking him to excavate memories that are buried under 10,000 years of accumulated trauma and degradation. They are asking him to somehow convey the emotional reality of experiences that have been reduced to data points in his mechanical mind. They are asking him to be something he no longer is, to be the living history they want, rather than the damaged survivor he has become. Bjorn could tell them facts. He could recite the tactical details of campaigns he fought in. He could list the worlds he conquered, the enemies he slew, the victories he contributed to. This is what they get when they consult him, and this is valuable in its own way. But this is not what they really want. They want to know what it felt like, what it meant, what the Great Crusade was as a lived experience rather than as a series of historical events. And this, Bjorn cannot give them, not because he is unwilling, but because he no longer possesses it himself. The feeling has eroded away, leaving only the bones of memory. The meaning has been lost to time and trauma. The lived experience has been replaced by disconnected fragments that no longer cohere into anything that could be meaningfully communicated. So Bjorn often falls silent when pressed about these matters, or he gives brief, factual responses that satisfy the tactical requirements of whatever question he has been asked, but provide none of the emotional or experiential context his brothers hope for. And in this silence, in this gap between expectation and reality, lies one of the great tragedies of the Imperium. Its most ancient living hero cannot tell his sons what their chapter's golden age actually felt like, because the mechanisms that preserve his life have destroyed his ability to remember in any way that matters. Other ancient dreadnoughts, variations on a theme. While Bjorn represents the most extreme case of longevity among loyalist dreadnoughts, he is far from unique in his predicament. Across the Imperium, other ancient dreadnoughts face similar struggles with memory degradation, temporal dislocation, and the impossibility of conveying what they have lost. Consider Rylanor, the Ancient of Rights of the Emperor's Children, who survived the betrayal at Istvan III and spent 10,000 years alone on that dead world, planning his revenge against his corrupted Primarch Fulgrim. Rylanor was interred in his Contemptor pattern dreadnought before the Horus Heresy, making him one of the oldest dreadnoughts still in service at the time of his final battle. He had fought during the Great Crusade as part of Fulgrim's honor guard, witnessing firsthand the glory of the Third Legion before their fall to Slanesh. But Rylanor's 10 millennia of isolation did something even more destructive to his memories than the normal degradation experienced by dreadnoughts in stasis. He remained conscious, trapped in his immobilized chassis, with nothing but his own degraded recollections for company. Over those vast eons, his mind broke and reformed countless times. The memories he retained became obsessions, polished to sharp edges through endless repetition, while everything else faded to nothing. When Rylanor finally confronted Fulgrim in the 41st millennium, he could remember clearly his hatred for what his Primarch had become, his determination to strike one final blow against the corruption that had destroyed his legion. But the days of glory that preceded the fall, the great Crusade campaigns he had fought with such distinction, the brotherhood he had known before Istvan III shattered it forever, these had been worn away by time and isolation until only the faintest impressions remained. Rylanor could not have told anyone what the Great Crusade felt like, even if he had wanted to. His consciousness had narrowed over 10,000 years to a single point: vengeance. Everything else, all the complexity and richness of his pre-heresy existence, had been sacrificed to maintain that one burning purpose. The price of his revenge was the complete loss of everything that had made that revenge necessary. Then there are the unnamed ancient dreadnoughts of the Blood Angels and their successor chapters, some of whom have served since the time of Sanguinius. Many of these have succumbed to the Black Rage, the genetic curse that causes Blood Angels to relive their Primarch's death at the hands of Horus, losing themselves in endless cycles of rage and bloodlust. For these dreadnoughts, what little memory they retain of the Great Crusade is hopelessly tangled with false memories of events they did not witness, experiences they did not have, filtered through the fractured lens of their gene curse. When a Black Rage dreadnought speaks of the past, he might describe fighting at the Siege of Terror with perfect clarity and terrible emotion, even if he was actually fighting orcs on some forgotten frontier world at the time. The Black Rage overwrites their actual memories with the psychic imprint of Sanguinius's final moments, making it impossible to separate what they truly experienced from what their curse makes them believe they experienced. These dreadnoughts cannot serve as reliable witnesses to history because their testimony has been corrupted at the neurological level by the flaw in their gene seed. The Leviathan pattern dreadnoughts present another variation on the theme of memory loss. These massive, heavily armed war machines were built during the later stages of the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, designed to be more powerful than standard dreadnoughts, but at significant cost to their pilots. The Leviathan systems place immense strain on the interred Marine's brain, slowly killing him unless he is given extended periods of recovery between deployments. The Leviathan was developed in secret on Terra during the latter days of the Great Crusade, created without the knowledge of the Mechanicum. Its massive frame incorporated hybridized technologies, some dating back to the Dark Age of technology itself. The resources required to build even a single Leviathan were nearly equal to that of a knight, making them incredibly rare, even at the height of the Imperium's power. Their armament was unmatched, capable of cracking open fortifications and obliterating enemy armor with devastating efficiency. But the power came at a terrible price. The little understood mechanisms unique to the Leviathan pattern inflicted tremendous psychological and neurological strain on the pilot. The machine's immense systems required such intensive neural interfacing that the pilot's consciousness became trapped in what survivors described as waking nightmares. Many Leviathan pilots reported being haunted by visions of the heresy, even if they had never participated in it, as if the machine itself carried psychic impressions of the horrors it had witnessed. The degradation was not just psychological. The neural load required to pilot a Leviathan was so severe that it caused actual physical damage to the pilot's brain tissue at an accelerated rate. Where a standard Dreadnought pilot might serve for centuries before showing signs of serious deterioration, a Leviathan pilot could experience comparable degradation in mere decades of active service. The only way to slow this process was to limit deployment time strictly, giving the pilot extended periods in stasis between activations to allow what healing could occur. Many chapters that still possess Leviathans use them sparingly, understanding that each activation brings their honored ancient closer to final death. But during the Horus heresy, when casualties mounted and every advantage mattered, Leviathan dreadnoughts were deployed for extended periods without adequate rest. Even chapters known for their care of the fallen, like the Salamanders, found themselves burning through Leviathan pilots at alarming rates as the stakes escalated. The choice was brutal, but necessary. Sacrifice the pilot's long-term survival for immediate tactical advantage, or preserve the pilot at the cost of potentially losing battles that could decide the fate of entire worlds. The toll this took on Leviathan pilots was catastrophic. Those who survived the heresy did so with their minds shattered by the strain. Some became catatonic between battles, their consciousness withdrawing so completely that tech priests could not be certain anyone remained inside the sarcophagus until combat stimulation triggered some residual response. Others experienced what the apothecaries called consciousness fracturing, where the pilot's personality seemed to split into multiple conflicting voices, each one controlling the Leviathan for brief periods before being replaced by another fragment of the original consciousness. Those Leviathan dreadnoughts that survived into the 41st millennium are often barely conscious, their minds worn to fragments by the excessive strain of their chassis. They can still fight, their weapon systems and tactical subroutines functioning perfectly, but the person who was once a space marine is little more than a ghost, a fading echo of consciousness that responds to commands but possesses almost no interior life. If asked about the Great Crusade, these dreadnoughts might not even understand the question, their degradation so complete that they no longer remember having memories. One particular Leviathan pilot, whose name has been lost to imperial records, was said to have fought from the Ullanor Crusade through the Siege of Terror, an unprecedented span of continuous service for a Leviathan. By the time he was finally granted rest in the early years of the Scouring, the tech priests who examined his sarcophagus reported that his brain tissue had deteriorated to such an extent that it was unclear how he had remained conscious at all. His final recorded words, spoken as he was being prepared for what would become eternal stasis, were simply, "I don't remember who I was." The pilot never woke again, and his chapter, recognizing that nothing meaningful of the man remained, chose to grant him the peace of permanent shutdown rather than condemn what little consciousness survived to further service. This fate awaited many Leviathan pilots. The machine that made them the most powerful dreadnoughts on the battlefield also ensured that they would be among the shortest lived in terms of functional consciousness. For those rare Leviathan pilots who do survive into the 41st millennium with any degree of awareness intact, the memories of the Great Crusade have been so thoroughly destroyed by the neural strain that they can offer nothing beyond the most basic tactical observations. The emotional content, the sense of what it felt like to fight during that era, these have been burned away by the very power that made them so effective in battle. Even dreadnoughts of more standard patterns, those who have not suffered Relanor's isolation, or the Blood Angel's curse, or the Leviathan's excessive strain, still face the fundamental problem of time. 10,000 years is simply too long for an organic brain to maintain coherent autobiographical memory, especially when that brain has been subjected to the constant trauma of neural interface and the discontinuity of stasis sleep. There are stories throughout the Imperium of ancient dreadnoughts who can no longer remember their own names, who must be reminded of their identity by tech marines reading from ancient records. There are accounts of dreadnoughts who believe they are still fighting in the Great Crusade, who issue orders to brother legions that no longer exist, who call for primarchs who have been dead or missing for 10 millennia. There are reports of dreadnoughts who have become trapped in loops, repeating the same phrases or recounting the same half-remembered battle over and over, their consciousness unable to form new memories or access old ones coherently. Each of these cases represents not just individual tragedy, but the loss of irreplaceable historical knowledge. These ancient dreadnoughts witnessed events that no written record fully captures. They fought in campaigns that are now known only through fragmentary accounts. They served under primarchs, whose personalities and leadership styles are now matters of scholarly debate. They experienced the Great Crusade as living, breathing reality rather than as ancient history. But they cannot share what they know, because what they know has been destroyed by the very mechanisms meant to preserve it. The dreadnought chassis that saved their lives has killed their memories. The stasis sleep that allowed them to survive across vast spans of time has shattered their sense of continuity. The neural interface that lets them fight on as walking weapons has eroded their ability to remember why those fights matter. So when these ancient dreadnoughts are consulted, when younger Marines ask them about the Great Crusade, they offer what they can. Tactical assessments, strategic evaluations, dry recitations of facts and figures. But the emotional truth, the felt experience, the meaning that would make those facts more than mere data, this has been lost. And in that loss, the Imperium has been impoverished in ways it cannot fully understand, because it no longer has access to the memories of its golden age as they were, actually lived. The emotional landscape, what has been lost. To truly understand why ancient dreadnoughts cannot or will not describe what the Great Crusade felt like, we must consider what kinds of experiences have been lost to memory degradation. It is not merely facts that have faded, but the entire emotional landscape that gave those facts meaning and context. Consider what it meant to fight alongside the Emperor. Not as an abstraction, not as a distant commander or a figure in historical texts, but as a living presence on the battlefield. The Emperor was not just powerful, he was transcendent. Space Marines who served in his immediate presence described feeling absolutely certain of victory, completely secure in the righteousness of their cause, filled with purpose so clear and absolute that all doubt became impossible. Imagine being in the thick of battle, surrounded by enemies, watching brothers fall around you, and then the Emperor arrives. His presence alone transforms the battlefield. Enemies flee in terror or simply collapse, overwhelmed by the psychic pressure of his existence. Your own fatigue vanishes, replaced by strength you did not know you possessed. The Emperor's voice cuts through the chaos of combat, issuing orders with such perfect clarity that you understand not just what to do, but why it matters, how your individual actions fit into the greater strategy, how this single battle contributes to the vast campaign to unite humanity. And when the battle ends, when you stand among the carnage and the Emperor looks upon you, you feel seen, not just noticed, but understood, known, valued. The Emperor does not merely command his warriors, he knows them individually, understands their strengths and weaknesses, appreciates their sacrifices. To serve under the Emperor was to be part of something so much larger than yourself that individual death became meaningless, while simultaneously feeling that your individual contribution was essential and recognized. This is what ancient dreadnoughts experienced. This is the emotional reality they lived through. But try to imagine describing this experience after 10,000 years of memory degradation. How do you convey the feeling of certainty the Emperor inspired, when you can barely remember what certainty feels like? How do you communicate the sense of purpose, when your own existence has become nothing but endless cycles of wake, fight, sleep? How do you describe being seen and valued when you have spent millennia being treated as a relic, honored, but not truly known? The ancient dreadnoughts remember, in some abstract way, that fighting alongside the Emperor was significant. They know it mattered. But the actual feeling of it, the emotional impact that made those moments the defining experiences of their lives, this has eroded to almost nothing. What remains is like a photograph of a sunset compared to actually watching the sunset. All the data present, but none of the beauty, none of the feeling that makes the experience meaningful. Or consider what it meant to be present when a Primarch was reunited with his legion. These were moments of transcendent joy, of completion, of a family made whole. A Space Marine was already superhuman, already far beyond mortal capability, but he still felt incomplete without his gene father. The Emperor had created him, yes, but he was made from a Primarch's genetic template, and something in his soul recognized that he was only half-formed until he stood in that Primarch's presence. When the day of reunion came, when a legion met its Primarch for the first time, it was like finding a part of yourself you did not know was missing. The Primarch was everything his sons aspired to be: impossibly charismatic, brilliant beyond measure, powerful beyond imagination. But more than that, he understood them in a way no one else could, because they were literally born from his essence. His values were their values. His strengths were their strengths, magnified to perfection. His vision for what they could become was their vision, clarified and given form. The brotherhood that formed between a Primarch and his legion was unlike any other relationship in the Imperium. It was not merely loyalty, though loyalty was certainly present. It was not merely admiration, though the Marines admired their gene fathers beyond all others. It was a form of love, of belonging, of purpose that cannot be fully captured in words. To serve your Primarch was to fulfill your deepest nature, to become most truly yourself, to find meaning in a way that normal humans can barely comprehend. Ancient dreadnoughts remember their Primarchs. They remember fighting under their command, following them into battles that should have been impossible, watching them work miracles of leadership and strategy and personal combat. But the feeling of it, the sense of completion and belonging and purpose that defined their relationship with their gene fathers, this has faded to abstraction. They know they loved their Primarchs. They cannot truly remember what that love felt like. This is compounded by the fact that most of the loyalist Primarchs are gone, dead, vanished, lost to the warp, or to other fates unknown. The ancient dreadnoughts wake from stasis to find that the beings who defined their existence, who gave their service meaning and direction, have been absent for 10,000 years. The Marines around them venerate these Primarchs as legends, as mythical figures whose deeds are recorded in sacred texts and whose names are invoked in prayers. But for the ancient dreadnoughts, the Primarchs were real. They were flesh and blood, personalities with quirks and preferences and moods. They were fathers and brothers and commanders, not legends. Try to imagine the dislocation. You fall asleep fighting beside your father, the center of your universe, the being who makes your existence meaningful. You wake up 10,000 years later, and everyone around you treats that same being as a mythological figure, worshipped but not truly known. They ask you what he was like, expecting some profound wisdom, some insight into the nature of this legendary demigod. But what can you say? How do you describe your father to people who only know him as a figure in sacred histories? How do you convey the warmth of his presence, the wit of his humor, the weight of his disappointment, the joy of his approval, when all they want is stories of his battlefield prowess? And underneath all of this, there is the terrible knowledge that even if you could find the words, even if your memories were crystal clear rather than degraded fragments, you could not make them understand. because the galaxy they inhabit is so far removed from the one you knew that the very context necessary to make sense of the Great Crusade has been lost. The Great Crusade was fought with hope, with certainty of victory, with belief in a future where humanity would dominate the stars, protected from all threats, unified under a single banner. This hope, this certainty, this belief permeated everything. It was the bedrock, emotional foundation upon which all the sacrifices and struggles of that era rested. But the Imperium of the 41st millennium has no such hope. It fights for survival, not victory. It struggles to maintain what it has, not to expand or improve. It is beset on all sides by enemies that cannot be defeated, only momentarily held at bay. Superstition and religious fanaticism have replaced the imperial truth's rationalism. Technological regression has replaced innovation. Stagnation has replaced progress. How do you describe hope to people who have never known it? How do you convey the feeling of certainty to those who live in constant doubt? How do you explain what it meant to build something you believed would last forever, when everyone around you is just trying to delay the inevitable collapse? The ancient dreadnoughts look out at the Imperium they helped create and do not recognize it. The values they fought for have been abandoned or corrupted. The institutions they established have ossified into parodies of themselves. The future they believed they were building has become a dystopian nightmare of oppression and ignorance and endless war. And the Marines who ask them about the Great Crusade cannot understand how radically different that era was, how utterly the Imperium has fallen from what it once promised to be. So the ancient dreadnoughts remain silent, or offer only the barest facts, because anything more would require them to confront not just their own loss, but the loss of everything they fought for. Better to give tactical briefings, to share strategic assessments, to be useful in the ways that require no emotional engagement. Better to avoid the pain of remembering a golden age that their memories can no longer fully capture, and that the current Imperium could never understand, even if those memories were perfect. The burden of being living history. The ancient dreadnoughts occupy a peculiar position within their chapters and the wider Imperium. They are simultaneously revered and isolated, honored and misunderstood, valued for what they represent, and yet unable to fulfill the expectations placed upon them. When a chapter awakens one of its ancient dreadnoughts, it is not merely calling upon a powerful weapon, though that is certainly part of the calculation. It is consulting a living link to its past, a witness to events that have passed into legend, a repository of wisdom accumulated over centuries or millennia of service. The Marines who stand before the dreadnought sarcophagus often do so with a mixture of awe and expectation. They are in the presence of a hero whose deeds are recorded in their chapter's holiest texts, a warrior who fought battles they can only read about, who served under commanders that now exist only in memory. But this reverence creates its own burden. The ancient dreadnought is expected to be more than just a weapon, or even just a source of tactical knowledge. He is expected to embody his chapter's history, to personify its values and traditions, to serve as a living connection to its founding ideals. Young Marines look to him for inspiration, for guidance, for reassurance that their struggles have precedent and meaning. Officers consult him not just for his strategic acumen, but for his perspective, for the wisdom that supposedly comes from having witnessed centuries of war. This expectation is, in many cases, impossible to fulfill. The ancient dreadnought has become what he is precisely because the mechanisms that preserve his life have destroyed much of what would make him a reliable historian or wise counselor. His memories are fragmentary, his emotional responses are muted or non-existent. His sense of continuity has been shattered by repeated cycles of stasis. He is not the wise ancient his brothers imagine, but a damaged survivor struggling to maintain coherence across vast gulfs of time. Yet he cannot admit this. To do so would be to shatter the illusion, to reveal that the living history his chapter venerates is actually a broken thing, a remnant that has forgotten more than it remembers. The young Marines need to believe that their ancient is still the hero he once was, that his preservation was worth the cost, that consulting him provides genuine connection to their chapter's glorious past. To tell them that most of that past has eroded away, that the dreadnought they revere is more machine than marine, more tactical database than living consciousness, would serve no purpose except to destroy one of their last links to an era they can never experience firsthand. So the ancient dreadnought performs. He speaks when expected to speak, offering what wisdom he can cobble together from his fragmentary memories. He fights when called upon to fight, embodying his chapter's martial prowess. He participates in ceremonies and rituals that he can barely remember the origins of, allowing younger Marines to believe they are maintaining sacred traditions passed down from their founding. He becomes, in effect, an actor playing the role of himself, of who he once was, of who everyone needs him to still be. This performance is exhausting in ways that physical combat never could be. Combat is straightforward. Identify threats, eliminate threats, extract to safety. The dreadnought's tactical systems handle most of this automatically, his degraded consciousness needing to provide only high-level direction. But maintaining the fiction of being a wise ancient, of being a reliable connection to history, requires constant effort to conceal the gaps in his memory, to pretend his recollections are clearer than they are, to perform wisdom he is not certain he still possesses. The isolation this creates is profound. The ancient dreadnought is surrounded by his brothers, is honored by them, is treated with reverence and respect. But he is not truly known to them. They see what they expect to see, a legendary hero preserved through the centuries. They do not see the damaged consciousness struggling to maintain coherence, the fragmentary memories that no longer form a complete picture, the personality that has been worn away by time and trauma until little remains but habit and programming. This gap between perception and reality is exacerbated when the dreadnought is asked about the Great Crusade. His brothers approach him with questions that reveal how little they understand about memory degradation, about the costs of dreadnought internment, about what it means to have lived for 10,000 years, but experienced only decades of consciousness. They expect detailed accounts, vivid descriptions, emotional testimony. They want to know what it felt like to walk among legends, to fight in an age of heroes, to serve the Emperor himself. And the ancient dreadnought, looking out through his optical sensors at these earnest young Marines, realizes that he cannot give them what they want. Not because he is unwilling, but because he no longer possesses it. The memories have degraded. The emotional content has eroded. The continuity has been shattered. What remains are fragments, disconnected observations, tactical assessments that capture facts but nothing of feeling. He could try to explain this. He could describe the process of memory degradation, the effects of stasis sleep, the way neural interface erodes organic consciousness over time. But what purpose would this serve? His brothers need to believe that their chapter's history is preserved in his consciousness. They need to believe that consulting him provides genuine access to the past. They need to believe that his preservation was worth the cost, that he is still in some meaningful sense the hero whose deeds they venerate. To tell them otherwise would be cruel. It would take away one of their few remaining connections to an era that defines their identity. It would force them to confront the reality that their most ancient hero is damaged beyond repair, that the price of his preservation was the destruction of most of what made preservation worthwhile. It would serve no purpose except to replace their hope with despair. So the ancient dreadnought does what ancient dreadnoughts have learned to do. He offers what he can, the tactical knowledge that remains intact, the strategic assessments that do not require intact emotional memory. He performs the role expected of him, speaking in brief phrases that sound wise through their very brevity, allowing his brothers to interpret his silence as profundity rather than absence. He protects them from the truth of his condition, because that protection is one of the few gifts he can still give. But the cost of this protection is his own isolation. He cannot share his real struggles with his brothers. He cannot admit how much he has forgotten. He cannot confess that most days he wakes not knowing where or when he is, that the face of his Primarch has become indistinct in his memory, that he can no longer clearly recall what it felt like to be alive in the conventional sense. He bears these burdens alone, entombed in adamantium, separated from genuine connection with anyone, existing as a symbol rather than a person. And when asked about the Great Crusade, about what it felt like to fight in that golden age, he often falls silent. Not because the memory is too precious to share, but because there is no memory left that could be shared. There are only fragments, data points, tactical assessments stripped of emotional context. The feeling has gone, leaving only facts. The meaning has eroded, leaving only mechanics. This is the burden of being living history, to be treated as a repository of the past, while that past crumbles within you. To be consulted for wisdom you are not certain you still possess. To be revered for experiences you can no longer clearly recall. To be expected to embody an era that has become foreign, even to you, the only survivor who actually lived it. The ancient Dreadnoughts bear this burden because they have no choice. They cannot die except by destruction in battle. They cannot leave their sarcophagi. They cannot escape the role their chapters have assigned them. All they can do is continue, waking to fight, sleeping to preserve what little remains, slowly eroding across the ages while maintaining the fiction that they are still the heroes their brothers need them to be. The choice of silence. Understanding the degradation of memory, the isolation across time, the burden of impossible expectations, we can finally address the central question directly. Why won't ancient Dreadnoughts describe what the Great Crusade felt like? The answer is not simple, but it can be articulated. First, and most fundamentally, they cannot describe it, because they themselves no longer possess coherent memories of what it felt like. The emotional content has been destroyed by 10 millennia of neural interface strain, stasis sleep disruption, and biological decay. What remains in their consciousness is tactical data, bare facts stripped of the feeling that made those facts meaningful. They remember fighting alongside the Emperor in the same way a historical database remembers, as information rather than as lived experience. When an ancient Dreadnought is asked what it felt like to stand in the Emperor's presence, he searches his degraded memory and finds data. He knows he was there. He can perhaps recall specific tactical decisions the Emperor made, or general assessments of the Emperor's capabilities. But the feeling of it, the awe and certainty and purpose that defined the experience, has eroded to abstraction. He knows these emotions existed. He cannot access them anymore. Trying to describe an emotion you know you once felt, but can no longer access, is perhaps worse than never having felt it at all. It is to be aware of the absence, to understand that something profound has been lost, to confront the gap between what you should be able to recall and what actually remains. For an ancient Dreadnought asked to describe the Great Crusade, every question is a reminder of loss. Every attempt to answer reveals another memory that has degraded past the point of useful recall. Second, they choose not to describe it because doing so would force them to confront how much they have lost. Memory degradation is gradual enough that it can be ignored day to day, especially when most of those days are spent in stasis. But being asked to provide detailed accounts of the past, being pressed for emotional testimony about experiences that should be vivid but have faded to fragments, forces the ancient Dreadnought to consciously acknowledge his deterioration. This acknowledgement is painful. Every Marine, even one entombed in a Dreadnought for millennia, retains some sense of self, some attachment to who he once was. To confront the reality that most of that person has been destroyed, that the consciousness piloting the Dreadnought is a diminished remnant of the hero it once was, is to face a kind of ongoing death. Not the clean death of battle, but a slow dissolution where pieces of you disappear over centuries until almost nothing recognizable remains. Ancient dreadnoughts, who retain enough self-awareness to understand their condition, often choose to avoid this confrontation. Better not to examine too closely what has been lost. Better to exist in the moment of each awakening, performing whatever duties are required, than to inventory the damage and realize how extensive it has become. Better to remain silent about the past than to discover through attempted recall just how little of that past survives. Third, they remain silent because they understand that their brothers could not comprehend the answer even if they could articulate it. The galaxy of the Great Crusade is so radically different from the Imperium of the 41st Millennium that the fundamental emotional context necessary to understand what that era felt like no longer exists. Imagine trying to describe the feeling of hope to someone who has never experienced it. Not hope for a minor outcome, but absolute certainty that humanity's future was secure, that the struggles of the present were building something eternal, that victory was not just possible but inevitable. The Marines of the 41st Millennium exist in a state of constant crisis. They fight to delay the Imperium's collapse, not to achieve ultimate victory. They worship the Emperor as a god, not as a living leader who walked among them. They serve an Imperium that is failing rather than one that is triumphant. From within this context, the emotional reality of the Great Crusade becomes incomprehensible. When an ancient dreadnought tries to describe what it felt like to fight during that era, he is describing experiences that have no equivalent in his brothers' lives. They have never known certainty of victory. They have never experienced unity of purpose across the entire Imperium. They have never witnessed the Emperor in the flesh or served under primarchs who were present and active rather than dead or missing. The ancient dreadnought understands this gap. He understands that his words will be misinterpreted, filtered through a mindset shaped by 10,000 years of decline and desperation. His brothers will hear his descriptions of the Great Crusade and try to map them onto their own experiences, but the mapping will fail because the underlying emotional reality is too different. What he describes as hope, they will hear as confidence. What he means by unity, they will interpret as mere organization. What he experienced as building an eternal empire, they will understand as just more war. So why speak? Why try to bridge an unbridgeable gap? Why force his brothers to confront how far the Imperium has fallen from what it once promised to be? Better to remain silent, to let them maintain their own interpretations of the past, than to reveal how utterly alien the Great Crusade would seem to anyone who exists entirely within the degraded reality of the 41st Millennium. Fourth, they remain silent to protect their brothers from truths that would serve no purpose except to demoralize. The ancient dreadnoughts understand something that many Imperial citizens do not. The Imperium is dying. Not quickly, not dramatically, but through slow attrition, through loss of technology, through accumulation of damage that can never be repaired, through the sheer weight of 10,000 years of constant war. If an ancient dreadnought were to speak honestly about the Great Crusade, if he were to describe the technological sophistication, the unity of purpose, the hope for the future that characterized that era, he would by implication be revealing how far the Imperium has fallen. He would be showing his brothers that what they fight to preserve is a pale shadow of what once was, that the glorious Imperium they believe they serve is actually a slowly collapsing ruin trading on past greatness. This knowledge would serve no useful purpose. The Marines asking about the Great Crusade cannot change the Imperium's trajectory. They cannot restore what has been lost or reverse 10 millennia of decline. All they can do is continue fighting, serving as best they can, maintaining what remains. To burden them with the knowledge of how much better things once were, how much has been lost, how far they fall short of their own founding ideals, would only make their service more difficult without providing any benefit. The ancient dreadnoughts understand this. They understand that sometimes ignorance is mercy, that not all truths need to be spoken, that protecting morale is as important as sharing knowledge. So they remained silent about the full reality of the Great Crusade, offering only sanitized versions, tactical assessments, fragments that capture facts but conceal the emotional devastation of comparing then to now. Finally, they remain silent because words are simply inadequate to the task. Even if the ancient dreadnoughts possessed perfect memories, even if their brothers could fully comprehend what they described, even if there were no strategic reasons for silence, human language itself would fail to capture what the Great Crusade felt like as a lived experience. How do you describe in words the feeling of absolute certainty? The sense of fighting for something you know will endure? The experience of serving beside a being who radiates purpose so profound that doubt becomes impossible? How do you convey what it meant to be part of a brotherhood that spanned the galaxy, united in common cause, secure in the knowledge that your sacrifices served something greater than yourself? These experiences exist at a level deeper than language can reach. They are composed not just of thoughts and emotions, but of physical sensations, of contextual factors, of cumulative effects that build over years of shared struggle. To reduce them to words is to strip away most of what made them meaningful, to create a description so impoverished compared to the reality that speaking seems like betrayal of the memory itself. The ancient dreadnoughts understand this inadequacy. They understand that any description they offer will be so diminished compared to what they actually experienced that it might be worse than silence. Better to let their brothers imagine the Great Crusade's glory than to attempt a description that inevitably disappoints, that captures facts but loses the essence, that provides information while failing to convey meaning. So they choose silence, not from unwillingness to share, not from desire to hoard knowledge, not from any petty withholding, but from the understanding that silence is more honest than inadequate words. When they cannot give a true account, when their memories have degraded past the point of useful recall, when the gulf between their experience and their brother's comprehension is too wide to bridge, when words themselves prove insufficient to the task, silence becomes the most truthful response. This silence is not empty. It carries weight, meaning, truth of its own kind. It tells those who understand that the Great Crusade was something beyond description, something that cannot be captured in tactical briefings or historical accounts, something that existed as lived experience in ways that resist translation into language. The ancient dreadnought's silence says, this was real, this was profound, this mattered more than words can express, and it is gone. What their silence tells us. Even in their refusal or inability to speak, even in the gaps and absences that characterize their testimony, the ancient dreadnoughts reveal truths about the Great Crusade that more explicit accounts could never capture. Their silence tells us that the Great Crusade was genuinely different from anything the 41st millennium knows. If it were merely more of the same, if it were just another era of war with better resources and more hope, the ancient dreadnoughts would have no trouble describing it. They could simply reference current experiences and add superlatives. But their silence, their struggle to find words, their eventual retreat into tactical assessments devoid of emotional content, all of this reveals that the Great Crusade was something categorically different. An experience so unlike anything their brothers have known that comparison becomes impossible. This tells us that the Imperium truly has fallen from what it once was. The ancient dreadnoughts' inability to make their brothers understand what the Great Crusade felt like is not a failure of communication, but an illustration of how fundamentally the Imperium has changed. The emotional landscape, the assumptions about humanity's future, the relationship between citizen and state, the very purpose of the Imperium itself. All of this has shifted so dramatically that someone describing the Great Crusade might as well be describing an alien civilization. Their silence also reveals the cost of dreadnought preservation. The Imperium treats dreadnoughts as a blessing, a way to preserve its greatest heroes beyond death. but the ancient dreadnoughts' inability to share their most precious memories, their fragmentary recall, their isolation across time. All of this suggests that preservation comes at a cost that might exceed its benefits. What good is preserving a warrior if the preservation process destroys most of what made him valuable beyond his ability to pilot weapons? This is not an argument that dreadnoughts should not be created. The tactical value of these war machines is undeniable, and many Marines who would otherwise die can continue serving through internment. But the ancient dreadnought's silence forces us to acknowledge that the process is not the pure gift the Imperium claims, that there is genuine tragedy in a preservation that destroys the consciousness it seeks to maintain. The silence also tells us something about memory itself, about the relationship between experience and recall, about how much of what makes us who we are depends on the continuity of consciousness. The ancient dreadnoughts possess memories that should be invaluable, experiences that no one else can claim. But without the emotional content, without the contextual framework, without the sense of continuity that allows memories to cohere into meaningful narrative, those memories become almost worthless as testimony. This suggests that memory is not mere data storage, not simple recording of facts that can be accessed regardless of the state of consciousness doing the accessing. Memory is embedded in emotion, in context, in the continuous thread of experience that connects past to present. When that thread is broken, when the emotional content erodes, when the context is lost to time, memories cease to be truly memories and become something else, something more like historical records stored in a damaged archive. Perhaps most importantly, the ancient dreadnought's silence tells us that the Great Crusade cannot be understood from the outside, cannot be grasped through study or imagination, but could only be truly known by those who lived it. This has implications for how we understand history more broadly. It suggests that there are aspects of past eras that are simply lost to us, that cannot be reconstructed from documents and artifacts, that die with the last person who experienced them directly. The Imperium desperately wants to believe that the Great Crusade lives on in its ancient dreadnoughts, that consulting these heroes provides genuine access to that golden age. But the dreadnought's silence reveals the truth. The Great Crusade is gone. Not just the time period, not just the institutions and personalities, but the lived experience of what it meant to fight during that era has vanished, surviving only in fragments too disconnected to convey its truth. This loss is irreversible. No amount of technological advancement will restore the ancient dreadnought's degraded memories. No amount of scholarship will reconstruct what has been lost. The Great Crusade, as it was actually experienced, exists now only in those degraded fragments. And as the ancient dreadnoughts finally succumb to age or battle, even those fragments will disappear, leaving nothing but the distorted accounts of historians who never lived it. The ancient dreadnoughts understand this. They know they are the last holders of knowledge that cannot be passed on, the last witnesses to an era that cannot be truly described. And in their silence, they acknowledge this loss, accept it, and carry it as one more burden added to all the others they bear in service to an Imperium that no longer resembles the one they helped create. Conclusion. The weight of eternity. The ancient dreadnoughts of the Adeptus Astartes are perhaps the most tragic figures in the Imperium. They are held up as symbols of eternal service, preserved beyond death to continue fighting for the Emperor across vast gulfs of time. They are revered as living links to the Great Crusade, consulted for wisdom, honored as embodiments of their chapters' histories. They are the closest thing to immortality that the Imperium can offer its greatest heroes. But immortality, as the ancient dreadnoughts have learned, is a curse as much as a blessing. To live for 10,000 years is to watch everything you know disappear. To be preserved in a dreadnought chassis is to trade your humanity for extended service, your memories for tactical capability, your identity for functionality. To cycle through centuries of stasis sleep is to become unstuck in time, experiencing the galaxy in disconnected fragments that never cohere into meaningful continuity. When we ask why ancient dreadnoughts will not describe what the Great Crusade felt like, we are really asking them to explain experiences that have been destroyed by the very mechanisms that kept them alive. We are asking them to convey emotions they can no longer access, to share memories that have degraded to bare facts, to bridge a gulf of comprehension that 10,000 years of imperial decline have made unbridgeable. The ancient dreadnoughts remain silent, not from unwillingness, but from impossibility. They cannot describe what they themselves can no longer clearly recall. They cannot make younger brothers understand experiences that have no equivalent in the 41st millennium. They cannot put into words what exists in their damaged memories only as fragments and impressions stripped of emotional content. This silence is not failure. It is honesty. It is acknowledgement that some things cannot be shared, some experiences cannot be conveyed, some truths exist only in the consciousness that directly witnessed them. The Great Crusade, as it was actually lived, as it was felt and experienced by those who fought it, exists now only in the degraded memories of beings who are slowly ceasing to be conscious at all. And as the ancient dreadnoughts continue their service, waking to fight battles in a universe they no longer recognize, serving an Imperium that bears little resemblance to the one they helped build, slowly losing what little remains of their former selves to the erosion of time and trauma, they carry this knowledge with them. They are the last to remember, however imperfectly, the last to have witnessed, however dimly, the last links to an age that grows more legendary and less real with each passing century. When they finally fall in battle, when their sarcophagi are retrieved and their remains laid to rest, when the last ancient dreadnought who fought during the Great Crusade is gone, something irreplaceable will be lost to the Imperium. Not just tactical knowledge or strategic wisdom, though these will certainly be missed, but something more fundamental. The living memory of what the Imperium once promised to be, what it felt like to fight for that promise, what was lost when that promise failed. The ancient dreadnoughts cannot tell us what the Great Crusade felt like, but in their silence, in their struggles with degraded memory, in their isolation across time, they tell us something perhaps more important, that it was real, that it mattered, that it was something worth remembering, even if remembering has become impossible, that it was an age worth mourning, even if those who lived it can no longer articulate why. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the ancient dreadnoughts stand as monuments to what was lost, not just the Great Crusade itself, but the possibility it represented, the hope it embodied, the future it promised but failed to deliver. They are living tombs containing not just the remains of heroes, but the remains of an entire era, slowly crumbling across the centuries, until nothing will remain but the shells they inhabit, and the legends that have replaced their true memories. This is why they will not describe what the Great Crusade felt like, because in the end, they cannot. And perhaps, in the cruel calculus of the Imperium they serve, it is better that way. Better to let the past become legend than to force everyone to confront how far they have fallen from what they once were, from what they once believed they could become. The ancient dreadnoughts know this truth. They carry it with them, sealed in adamantium tombs, cycling between waking and sleeping, slowly fading across the ages. They are the last witnesses to humanity's golden age, and they are dying, taking their memories with them, leaving behind only silence. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore of Warhammer 40,000, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. We explore the grim darkness of the far future, examining the stories and tragedies that make this universe so compelling. Until next time, remember, in the darkness of the far future, even memory itself is not immune to decay.